We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No delusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Welcome to The Antidote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth-Cushel.
All right, as we are sitting here at the end of October, it is Sunday evening, October 31st. Hope everybody is having a great Halloween or whatever, if you don't celebrate or whatever, just having a great day out there. And we're ending the month off and getting ready to go into the month of November here. And we want to circle back, Jeremy, to going back to our talking about like the 20th anniversary of September 11th, some of our feelings and a couple of programs that we did. Of course, we covered some of the media climate surrounding Spike Lee, this documentary on about Feinberg, and we also gave some general thoughts about where we feel the what's important in terms of of investigations, in terms of getting as much of the truth as possible about where the evidence, I think, leads as far as the major aspects of complicity and culpability and truth regarding the events of September 11th, as well as the aftermath. And this time we're going to do a follow-up on this strain of thinking by focusing on a particular, a particular network, a couple of individuals and thinkers, particularly around something that we've been identifying recently. And we're going to get into a debate. We're going to be focusing on a person by the name of Lot in this particular installment of the networks around September 11th and analysis of the war on terror, geopolitical analysis, and aspects of that on Scott Horton, who is a pretty, I would say, prominent thinker, intellectual activist within what's known the libertarian movement. And Jeremy, do you want to talk a little more about what we're going to be getting into here? And then, of course, we can bring in other things if there's any other aspects that you want to bring in other than Scott Horton. But we'll talk a little bit about what we're going to be discussing here with regards to Scott Horton and a debate he had and an interview we listened to with him, and why this figures into our long-term, what we've been focusing on mainly for so much of the last 5 years of our program in terms of September 11th and networks and narratives going out, and kind of doing our own counterintelligence in terms of picking up narratives and people and what are being put out there and where it's positive and where it's problematic and how this will figure into that.
Yes. Okay. And one thing here is that it's very, we've put forth these conceptual frameworks for understanding deep events that are maybe not a singular action, such as September 11th, 9/11, and or then what we have picked up on as 11/9, which is also ongoing in many ways as actually part of a hybrid warfare, a political warfare operation that sure reached its apparent, at least for now, zenith somewhere between the polls of 11/9 of 2016, when Trump was announced the president. Still have not really gotten to the bottom of who did what in terms of what I would term the military aspect of 11/9, i.e. election fraud, election rigging, that level of surety in relationship to an operation beyond just the then intelligence part of it, and then the counterintelligence part of it. So somewhere suspended, between 11/9 of 2016 and then 1/6 of 2021, and now all of the wake of all of that is still in play. And so this 3-part conceptual framework of a military part of an operation, an intelligence part of an operation, and then a counterintelligence part of an operation is, I believe, crucial to understanding the way that these events that we might term using things like 9/11 or 11/9 actually fit into much larger historical frameworks and geostrategic interests. And so I would say that one of the I would say the most difficult category of those three is the counterintelligence aspect because there's so many layers to it. And by counterintelligence, I'll just quickly reemphasize what I mean when I talk about a military component, an intelligence component, and a counterintelligence component as a tripartite structure of an event. Military component means how do you guarantee kinetic effects, such as if it's something around an assassination, how does the actual murder take place? The bullet in the brain of Kennedy or something like that. But then also, how do you get flying objects going boom into buildings, and then buildings going boom? You know, those kinds of kinetic effects, the guarantee of kinetic outcomes. And so, in terms of an 11/9 operation, that would, because it's a very hybrid warfare scenario where it doesn't look like bombs being dropped, but what the ultimate military outcome is this guy, this asset of these interests being installed into this building, right? And so in order to do that, some of the kinetic effects you might look at would be something like guaranteeing that machines that count the votes for him are they're it's sure that they're going to get the right number, let's say, right? And so then he will then be installed into that building. So that'd be the military effects. Then the intelligence effects, or the intelligence aspect of this, is because most of these are false flag operations in structure. The intelligence side of it is how the production of the story that is then to be believed, even and or the people that are to be blamed for the actual military operation and who actually caused the effects rather than who is then said to be blamed. And this is most obvious in relationship to things like 9/11, where it's all about the hijackers or the Al-Qaeda cells, then the hijacking itself, and then the running of hijacked planes into buildings, and then this causing the entirety of the physical effects and death and destruction ultimately. And then that always then fits into the purpose, the reason. Almost always there's the reason why a certain group of people is chosen inside of the intelligence framework to be blamed for the actual military operation. Right. And so this is a little bit more complex in terms of 11/9 than it is for something like 9/11 or even something like the assassinations. Like why was Oswald the one to be blamed for the Kennedy operation? It's very possible there was even more reason for that than we know. But at the very least, it's a crucial through line to develop the intelligence framework for people to then to be told what to believe about who did it. So 11/9, the Trump MAGA, it's the through line actually is that this is actually the bubbling up of American populism. This is right-wing populism, and the American people are fed up on the right, and they don't trust the swamp, and they voted in massive numbers to put this guy in. And there's part of that that's true, right? So that's the important thing, and that's why where we get into these conundrums where people will totally reject people who sort of understand the basic reality of the military operation, and that it is a false flag operation at some level. will then sometimes totally reject the intelligence, the legend part of it, to basically say that's all a hoax or it's a total fraud in that way. Whereas no, it's an intelligence operation. So it exists. Is it synthetic? Yes. But is it based on real people? Very often. And so it gets more complicated in something like 11.9, where it's a actual hybrid warfare operation, because you can actually see where a part of the intelligence through line of 11.9 was this idea that it was all based on information warfare. Let's say that it was all based uh, on Cambridge Analytica, for example, and convincing people to vote or not vote. And sure, that was a big piece, and that then allows the alleged 11.9 debunkers to basically then try to limit that hangout to basically there was 100,000. The Russian government bought some guys, a hot dog vendor guy bought $100,000 of Facebook ads, and
Yeah.
that kind of scenario.
Right, the Eric Prince of Russia is just a hot dog vendor who once catered to Vladimir Putin. I don't know, maybe Eric Prince isn't even an entirely fair comparison, but I mean, in terms of like, sponsoring, or the Wagner organization and its global activities, but it's like it's just that's able to, by simply saying that, like, by making it about troll factories or troll farms or whatever, it's like you can say, well, and this is what, and we've talked about this before, this is how, like, oh, they're blaming Russian trolls for people, for people questioning, or for people questioning race and narratives about race and gender in our society. Oh, they're blaming Russian trolls for Black Lives Matter movement or whatever. And I mean, it's like it's simplistic, but also in a way it's kind of designed, because, like, the legacy media that's very much complicit, like in what we're talking about, like the New York Times can run a story about troll factories, and that's all the proof the debunkers need.
It's true. And so this is, I think, one of the lessons, even in looking back towards 9/11, which is what we're honing in on and we're continuing to focus on, is what we can learn about the both the responses and mm, the political environment in certain alternative political spheres. And what we're going to focus on for the next hour, I would say, would be this this neo-libertarian sphere, or this uprising in the libertarian sphere, based around the Mises Caucus and people like Scott Horton as the seen as the leading anti-war and 9/11 truth intellectuals, really, even though he separates himself out and is always apologizing to the truthers, is the way he often talks about it. Even when he went on Media Roots with Abby and Robbie Martin, he had a respectful disagreement or something like that with the truther mind state, or the truther claims in relationship to Robbie especially. And so this is what we're really beginning to hone in on, in terms of the both the possibilities here and the positive values that are brought to the table by this political sphere, what it means about their rising, in terms of, at the very least, inside of the Libertarian Party, but beyond that, but also the dangers and how it very much directly relates to the analytical trap and or downfall that we saw so many, especially in terms of like what we saw from 9/11 truthers, nine people who could be called 9/11 truthers during the 11/9 years, in terms of under Trump. How few, basically almost if any, really, in terms of actually really got it together to forensically break down 11/9 in a similar way that 9/11 was broken down. And so that then leads me to that this, what I started out by saying, that this third part, the counterintelligence part, is, I think, the most complex. It because the one thing about it is that it's also the one that's continuing ongoing. It's kinetic in its cover up, right? And so the counterintelligence is ultimately then how do you, in a very simplistic logic, it's the enforcer of the narrative of the intelligence legend over the physical and political forensics that would lead you to the actual military operation and who did it and why. And so that's the way that I see the counterintelligence piece of this. And so if you look at that kind of thing over a long term, you begin to really get into really complex and historically baroque channels of understanding that you then have to deal with, where you begin to you have to understand such things as what has become maybe the Mises Caucus inside of the Libertarian Party, inside of the Libertarian movement, as potentially, a channel of a long-term counterintelligence thread of some sort. And, simplistically, if we were doing the sort of simplistic conspiracy theorist thing, we would just go and say, oh, Mises, Ludwig von Mises comes to the United States under a Rockefeller Foundation grant. And and you'd be sort of done with the whole analysis. But I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, although that factor needs to be brought into the mix, right? And when you then begin to factor into how these kinds of narratives, political narratives, begin to work in our contemporary era, meaning 21st century, and then you throw in a key figure like Ron Paul into the mix, and then this dialectic that we see more and more between the libertarians and then what maybe the neo reactionaries, the neo Confederates, maybe in terms of certain aspects of what is represented by the CNP sphere, and then how that entire then that right alternative dialectic is managed, especially in relationship to maintaining these really, really big, important falsehoods and deceptions. And I'll just give one overarching example in terms of how this actually plays out before maybe I'll pass it back to you, Greg, and we can begin to get into the specifics of some of these conversations that we're actually referring to, such as Scott Horton's debate with the arch neocon Bill Kristol that took place in just a few weeks ago. Then some of the conversations that have been taking place surrounding the 20th anniversary of September 11th, including the aforementioned one with Scott Horton on Media Roots, specifically about Afghanistan and 9/11, but then also debriefing conversations between people like Scott Horton and Dave Smith, also in part of this Mises Caucus rising sphere. Potentially, he looks like he really might be like the libertarian presidential candidate for 2024. And so how all of this then plays out. So my one example here is, all right, one of the crucial, I would say, positive principles, maybe the core positive principle that this crew, that this part of the libertarian specifically, and libertarian philosophy as it's understood at its core, at the very least in terms of what's now been described maybe as a anarcho-capitalism, those types of libertarians. The core of their moral argument has to do with a combination of the non-aggression principle and then voluntarism, which is actually comes in a logical subsequent out of the non-aggression principle, meaning that their principled commitment is that the moral individual, the naturally legal individual, cannot be forced into action by the state. And so that then is an extension of the non-aggression principle that basically says that individuals should follow the non-aggression principle and not use force against each other, except in pure self-defense. But then also, most especially, that the state should then also not be allowed to use aggressive force against other states and or other individuals, except in pure self-defense. Although the ultimate end in many ways is the minarchist, either the minimalization of the state and or the total abolition or withering away of the state. And so this is where you then get into, I believe, sort of philosophical misconceptions or not quite ripened understandings of political philosophy. But I'll put that aside for now by pointing out that in terms of these big things that principle then leads them to be on the right side of, for example, Scott Horton as a leading anti-war voice for many years, right? He's been doing anti-war radio programming, thousands, I think well over 2,000 programs in the 21st century, and a whole array and lots of really important information and writing. And he's basically, in a certain way, like Ryan Dawson is one of the people in this sphere who knows the most about some of the details about September 11th. And Scott Horton is one of the people who knows the most details about the 9/11 wars and the geopolitics of all of that. And so my main point is that when you actually look at the way that it's never the case. You can't think of an instance where the public narrative, i.e. the intelligence line of these operations that are then used to go to war, it's never the case that the public narrative and that the state is actually saying, we're going to go aggress upon these people. No, it's always seen as some kind of self-defense. It's always done under the aegis or the rubric of defense, the Defense Department, self-defense. And what became obviously outrageous in the post 9/11 era, obviously, was the idea of preemptive self-defense, which was what they then began to propose as the deep reason behind the attack on Iraq and overthrowing Saddam Hussein was, of course, what are you going to wait for? The smoking bullet of a nuclear cloud, as people like Condoleezza Rice said. And there's something very compelling about that logic. I mean, let's say you know, or at least you're saying that you know that these people are planning, planning to threaten you at the very least, then the question of self-defense becomes much more difficult. It's not a clear-cut, clean kind of moral principle about how long do you sit in your home and wait for a conspiracy to kill your family to unfold as long as you know it. So then the problem is that you cannot depend on the non-aggression principle in relationship to political wisdom. And the non-aggression principle will always continually be violated with deception. So if you allow if you don't defend your people from the deception in the first place, there's no way you're going to be able to enforce the non-aggression principle at the level of a society or a nation state. And so this then becomes crucial, I would say, in terms of the total and utter failure that's the best faith, the utter failure of someone like Scott Horton, if not the leading libertarian voice, anti-war voice, to actually root out the forensics, the actual forensics, the military forensics of something like September 11th. And finally, I believe a lot of this is just sort of proven. For example, let's say Ryan Dawson and Scott Horton, these crucial sort of public intellectuals of their own key spheres here, right? Ryan Dawson is the guru of this whole sphere in terms of 9/11. And Scott Horton is the guru of this sphere in terms of post 9/11 or 9/11 wars. And yet, and they're both very well read. They both have they know probably, I'd say Ryan knows probably 10 times the amount about the details and specifics of September 11th than I do. Okay. I'd say Scott Horton knows at least 10 times, maybe 50 times as much as I do in terms of the details of the 9/11 wars and the geopolitics of all of that, and the geography of all of that, and the history. So there's an issue here when these two guys that are this well read, this well learned in terms of these crucial areas are still here. What are we, 25 years after the publishing of the clean break paper? 25 years after the publishing of the clean break paper. And, people in those spheres have been talking about the clean break paper for 20 years, I'd say, probably. Maybe not that much, but somewhere in that realm, at least like during the post 9/11 era. I'm sure you could find Scott Horton beginning to talk about the clean break paper. And yet, every time we hear them talking about it, bringing it in, including Scott Horton, bringing it in with his debate with Bill Kristol, Ryan Dawson, every time he brings it up in terms of Syria, for example, it appears that they haven't even read the document, and it's not long. It's like a few pages, and it very clearly articulates a lot of what we've seen, which is the difference between the overthrow that was called for in Iraq versus the rollback, i.e. the destabilization that we've seen exactly proceed in Syria. So that right there, there's something really problematic just in terms of the intellectual integrity of these two pillars of this community, that they can't even get that right. And then when you begin to assess all of the wake, the political wake of not getting that little, it may seem like a little thing. All they do is conflate overthrow with rollback. That's a small little, that's just, some people would accuse me of being obsessing over language or meaning or something like that. But when you begin to actually parse that out and see then what someone like Ryan Dawson did in terms of, let's put aside 9/11, let's now focus on 11/9. And to this day, Ryan Dawson is probably one of the most important apologists, people who cover up for the 11/9 perps, including all the way to someone like Trump in this entire alt media sphere, I would think. And if you were just able to then see that the fulfillment of the Syria operation in many ways, the fact that there was a pushback by people like quote unquote Michael Flynn or Trump against the quote unquote neocons in relationship to their plan to overthrow Assad in Syria, there's a whole arc of failed analysis that goes on the back of just not having just quoted from the clean break paper. And the final thing I'll say in terms of Scott Horton before I hand it back to you, Greg, is that this then comes down to a problem of a lack of nerve or a failure of courage potentially in terms of the necessity of public discourse in relationship to someone who claims to be anti-war and to claim the non-aggression principle. Because if you don't defend your people and the others against the aggression of the lie, the aggression of the deception that always is the prelude to the physical destruction of the war, then you're just some kind of Chris Hedges hand wringer, on the right, is the way that I would put it. It's basically, what a nice little principle you have. You won the debate against Bill Kristol, but you failed to even debate the right person, and you failed to make the right basic claim, which is to accuse bad faith, not in terms of a difference of policy, but bad faith in terms of the lie, of the deception, of the intelligence operation not being the military operation in the case of September 11th. And so because Scott Horton fails to actually just put forth the written words of the clean break neocons, he ultimately leaves it in a place of where he fails to call out bad intention, which is, if you think about the best part of the law and holding people to account for crimes, it all comes down to intent. So it's as if, basically, let's say someone ran into someone in their car. They ran into someone on the street, a whistleblower on the street, got run over on a car. And there's a very big difference between, this person was drunk and stumbled, it was a blunder, they blundered it, versus, this was part of a deep operation to kill this whistleblower, and the intent was to kill. There's a very big difference between that. And it ultimately comes down to a failure of this moral nerve based on a failure of some kind of public intellect to not accuse, maybe it's not Bill Kristol, but to accuse those that went to war in Iraq of the actual ultimate crimes here, which is the actual orchestration of the acts which would then justify their wars, the ongoing wars too, right? Focus on Afghanistan. So you have to deal with 9/11. You have to deal with the actuality of 9/11. So if you don't call out that, it looks like whoever wrote the clean break paper got exactly what they wanted in terms of Iraq and Syria, and not that, Trump pushed back against the deep state, or they failed in Syria or something like that, then you're just on the road to reinforcing the first aggression against your people, which was the deception. Remember, a deception based on a murder, if you're talking about September 11th. So you fail to even identify the suspects. You can't enforce the non-aggression principle has to be enforced by people, but in this case, men, has to be enforced by men who are willing to hold account the perpetrators of the aggression, in this case, mainly other men. And if they don't do that in the first place, and they say, these guys, it was these other guys, these Al-Qaeda guys who did this, and then this whole other crew, including the whole axis held together by certain aspects of the neocons, in terms of threads right back to the heart of a key element of the long-term Israeli security establishment, that these people, they did it. They did it. They didn't wait for something to happen and then take advantage of it. This goes back to my critique that I made at the Left Out Forum in relationship to Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, where she has this incredible second to last chapter about losing the peace incentive that is actually forensic data suggesting motive of the Israeli security state for being behind 9/11. And yet the whole book is a defense against quote unquote conspiracy theories at some level. And her whole analysis, the shock doctrine, comes down to the idea of CIA psychiatry, where you purposefully put someone shock therapy, right? So-called therapy, in this case, shock trauma. You shock them and then you mold their mind based on the trauma. And so the analogy that I made is that it's as silly as claiming that CIA psychiatrists waited for people to like stumble, get drunk and stumble and push their finger into a light socket and then took advantage of that time to then pattern their mind in terms of mind control. Get the heck out of here. That's absurd. And so that then translates then to an absurdity that there's an underlying absurdity in terms of those that would say, okay, the neocons, this is everything they wanted. The project for the new American century, the clean break, the Zionist wars in the Middle East, the U.S. Imperial rollout into South Central Asia. And they just waited for something to happen. And that even then tracks back to problems of forensics of like, we're the responsible 9/11 truthers, where we say that the hijackers did actually do it and these guys just let them do it again. That putting aside all of the forensics that show that not to be the case, but just the underlying logic of it. If you actually believe that this group of people, let's say you're Scott Horton, you believe that the neocons had this whole agenda to shape the 21st century, and then is it really plausible that they would just wait? That this was going to happen and they just wait? Or that they're going to hope that some guys, that their intelligence assets are going to successfully hijack planes and then successfully run them into the targets, and then that their targets are going to be successfully enough damage to create enough of the mass trauma to do what they're going to do? That's absurd. That's prima facie absurd. But then that shuts off the question of the actual forensics that you need to deal with, whether it's actually just the whatever 3 to 5 pages of the clean break paper, or it's ground zero forensics in the case of September 11th.
I completely agree with you. And circling back to what you were saying about, the non-aggression principle, it's just, as you said, like, it's just not enough in terms of like, it has to actually be backed up. Like, you need to back the non-aggression principle up with, say, maybe, aggressive truth. Maybe it might be a way to
aggressive
put it, like
defense, right? Because it is. That's right.
Yeah. And so and this is another conversation for another time, but geopolitically, the non-aggression principle will run you into a lot of trouble or like this idea of like anti-interventionism, we just leave other people alone and they'll leave us alone or whatever. And in principle, I mean, that's nice, but in the geopolitical situation that we're in, it's more complicated than that. I mean, it's just like, it's more complicated than if like the United States were to just simply give up all of its military bases and just come home and build Fortress America or whatever, that all of our problems would go away. I mean, it's more complicated than that geopolitically, because there actually are subversive, hostile, foreign elements that are very that have, as we've identified with the 11/9 operation, even going before that and ever since, are using foreign, aided by elements domestically here in the U.S. that we've identified before. We don't need to rehash some of those networks now. So it's way more complicated than that, and that's where an effort to really try to get to the bottom of things such as both 9/11 and 11/9 would be key to actually instilling like an actual real serious productive usage of the principles of non-aggression and anti-interventionism. So that's one area. And then you mentioned the coming together in some ways with like more so Ryan Dawson maybe than a Scott Horton, but both of them. I mean, this is a problem with some of the people we're going to identify here, as well as a Ryan Dawson, who I think you correctly identified, coming together with, in terms of their narratives, with key proponents of around something like September 11th. And I mean, remember during this live stream we're discussing here, Dawson. We're referring to Dawson with these other activists. You could maybe talk a little more about that than I could, and maybe we'll go back to that before we're finished here. Dawson name dropping, Bernard Kerik, of course, receiving money and going to Israel, and his relationship with Eitan Wertheimer. But then, meanwhile, you listen to Ryan Dawson talk about Antifa and the organized left and the people that are out to destroy Trump, and MAGA and American conservative patriotism or whatever, and it sounds very similar to your Bernie Kerriks and your Rudy Giuliani. So I mean, that's another consequence of not trying to get to the bottom of like these, what's really going on with events like this. And so it's very important to just simply go beyond like these very paradigmatic, or I don't know if paradigmatic is even a word, but these paradigms and these talking points and this idea of the concept of, I ultimately think the concept of non-aggression principle and anti-interventionism and just leaving other people alone and all this and not going to war with people. It's ultimately a pretty toothless mindset when it's not backed up by deep, hard truth on these areas that are of such importance. And so now this brings us to it's very interesting. We're going to delve into Scott Horton here, and Scott Horton being this preeminent libertarian foreign policy voice. In a recent debate he had, I believe it was in New York City at the Soho Forum, with the person who is identified by a lot of people as the arch neocon, like the person who is most identified with American neoconservative, and that is Bill Kristol. In this debate between Horton and Kristol at the Soho Forum in New York City, which I think encapsulates a lot of this problem, and it goes back to prior themes about the nature of neoconservatism and what it is, and that we have delved into in the past on our programs and will continue to delve into. But I think that this debate between Horton and Kristol, as well as this follow-up interview that Horton did with Dave Smith, is very very instructive in terms of what we've been discussing, and where I think that in a lot of areas, all the way from the actual events itself of September 11th and the global war on terror that is followed since then, to the clean break document, to even an understanding of neoconservatism and what it is and how it works. All of this, I think, is encapsulated, or a lot of aspects of it is very much identifiable through this debate with the arch American neoconservative, who we more increasingly see as, yes, obviously a very, 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 very bad actor. I mean, it was Bill Kristol helping lead the media propaganda efforts to push for these illegal wars after the events of September 11th, and of course the lead up to it, his role with Project for New American Century, his role in pushing a pro-war propaganda, of course, leading up to it and after. But in a lot of ways, just increasingly is just a person to focus on, who I don't want to quite say is a boogeyman, because I mean, he is a very important and very destructive figure, but somebody who is focused on as like this be all end all. Like, if you know who Bill Kristol is, and you know who the Kagans are, and you know who David Frum is, then you understand neoconservatism. And it fits into this narrow box, I think, of also going back to what we call 11/9, that you can see the neocons were in a conspiracy to destroy Trump, because Bill Kristol is a neocon, and look at how he talks about Trump, and look at all these wars that Bill Kristol helped start. And so, once again, just an understanding. I don't know how much of this is willing, and I don't know how much this is unwilling, but at the very least, at best, a lack of understanding, and at worst, very deceptive, deliberate deception in terms of what the who the war hawks are and what they represent, and trying to make it out to just be this simple, very, I think, ultimately simplistic analysis. But let's delve into this debate between Bill Kristol and Scott Horton in some of the areas where, Scott Horton, I mean, I would say if I was a neutral observer, I'd have to give Scott Horton the advantage in a lot of areas, obviously, over Bill Kristol, who just pushes the typical American, as we maybe call them, paleo neoconservative talking points about spreading democracy and the importance of the American role in the world. And obviously, I mean that's very easy to push back against. But we can get into this and also show where Horton, under the idea that he's owning Bill Kristol and he's exposing, Bill Kristol and the neocons for what they are, ultimately, in our view, ends up falling short. And then to follow up with this discussion with Dave Smith, which delved even further into this debate and the talking points and the victory over Kristol. So let's get into this. Let's get into this Soho Forum debate. Unless you wanted to say something else beforehand.
No, let's get into it, Greg. And actually, maybe the way we could get into it is by exactly as you noted about the way that Bill Kristol is used. He is used. He sort of becomes almost like for this crew, for this set of libertarians, he becomes the George Soros of the neocons at some level, and that. And in multiple ways. So one thing that we could look at is that I think they acknowledged this when Dave Smith debriefed Scott on his wrecking of Bill Kristol, and he did wreck. He wrecked Bill Kristol. Bill Kristol looked like another weight class in terms of what he brought to the table, and Dave Smith accurately portrayed it as Bill Kristol basically throwing in the towel at some point. And then Scott Horton describing it as, this is the son of the biological, but also the intellectual son of the godfather of the neoconservative movement in some ways, or at least the father. Maybe the godfather is actually correct in terms of Irving Kristol, and maybe Leo Strauss is the intellectual father of the neoconservative movement, and they and all of that buildup, and he's an intellectual lightweight, Bill Kristol is. And that's exactly true.
I'd also throw in there, in terms of the intellectual godfathers of the neoconservative movement, would be Norman Poderitz of Commentary Magazine, who actually a lot of these neocons either did not support Trump or were very, at least rhetorically, neutral. But Norman Poderitz was also very much in this vein of Kristol and Strauss, and he openly endorsed Trump, I guess, as like the lesser evil over Hillary Clinton. So I throw Poderitz in there as well, and his ultimate support of Trump. So.
Well, that's very interesting, because then the way that you can also then see the role of a Bill Kristol in the mind sphere of these libertarians is he acts as the reverse psychology imprint that we noticed before the election of Trump actually took place. We questioned immediately whether there was not only a different whole crew of neocons that ultimately supported Trump, as you're pointing out, Greg, and we then evolved that analysis of the paleo neocons, which is Kristol is one of, if not the leading known paleo neocon, alongside someone like Robert Kagan, who were never Trumpers, versus this other crew, the new neocons. And we then also did another level of analysis around that in terms of Israel firsters and Israel seconders, and the Bill Kristols and Robert Kagans, for all their Zionism and all the accusations of their maybe primary Zionist drive in terms of their neoconservative, their neoconservatism and their Project for a New American Century goals. They're actually Israel seconders. They are they're hyper Zionists, but they are what they say they are. They are American imperialists. They don't seek to move to Tel Aviv or Jerusalem and run the world from there. No, they want to run it from the swamp. That's where it is. And
they believe basically in, I think, a very twisted version of like American global power, but they want they believe in they espouse a world that is quote unquote led by American military power, American economic power, the quote unquote democratic institutions that were set up post World War II. And that's where, I think a lot of them differ from people who actually would have no problem with seeing like elements of like global power being out of the hands of the United States, or less inclined to like, to actually participate in ground wars for quote unquote democracy if the strength of Israel or balance of power in the Middle East would be guaranteed even by that not taking place. I mean, these people are very much, as you say, American imperialists at heart in terms of they want American global power, like, American military power, American economic power to shape the world. And that's one area where I think that there is a difference with this other element where I don't think it's not quite that simple. And so just simply saying Bill Kristol's Israel first, and there was a lot of that, as we'll get into in the conversation with Dave Smith, where that was brought up, and like Bill Kristol being like this leader of like this clique, which includes these people who I don't think are quite as ideologically identified with Bill Kristol as an Adam, or excuse me, as a Scott Horton makes it out to be. It's not. This is ultimately at heart, it is American imperialism. That becomes an issue in some ways because like they are portrayed as simply like representing like the evils of the American state and all this, and the U.S. empire and all this. And there's a problem with that because it's not America per se. It's not like this is not, but at the same time, like they are acting as mouthpieces for a very, I would say, twisted version of American global power. But ultimately, it's not as simple as just like, they're shaping the wars for Israel and all this. I mean, it's not that simple. So
No, and so this is another example of like some really simple, a sort of gross level of logical analysis that seems like that should have made the rounds in terms of these kinds of levels of critical thinkers and political dissidents of some sort, especially during the Trump era. Something like, all right, what does the clean break paper actually say? What does that actually mean about what we're seeing? Then something like, oh, what about the concept of a neocon split, and that the quote unquote neocons are anti-Trump is not really what's going on. And what we saw was like, it took like even people like Robbie Martin, who are fairly interested in figuring out what's going on. It took him a few years, it looked like to me, at least into the Trump administration, to even begin to get his feet under him that there was this whole other crew backing Trump, even though he had all the data in the first place. And Robbie's way ahead at some level from like these sort of Scott Horton types, it looks like, at least publicly. Maybe there's something going on more privately. And definitely like Ryan Dawson is a regressive in terms of the political analysis of just these basic things of, oh, have you ever heard of, the George Soros boogeyman? So Bill Kristol is then sort of used, even his opposition to Trump is used as a way to actually give credibility to the way Trump was being marketed in a massive psychographical warfare operation that included, a government that people like Ryan Dawson and people like Scott Horton should have been interested in terms of the Netanyahu Israeli government, were key players in the psychographical framing warfare part of the Trump operation. And so part of that was just like the same guys who, the Arthur Finkelstein kids who helped install, or Arthur Finkelstein himself helped install Netanyahu in the first place. It was his children, Finky's kids, were the ones who led the way on the usage of George Soros as the boogeyman, with all of then the overlay of the allegations of the anti-Semitic dog whistling on top of that brings the ADL into the mix. And meanwhile, it got to such a fever pitch that it was the son of Netanyahu himself, installed by Arthur Finkelstein himself, who then the son Yair Netanyahu during the Trump years tweeting out the sort of the Jewish conspiracy meme that basically puts George Soros at the head, and then it's on down to Ehud Barak and all kinds of other people. And so that's an example of the pitch that this kind of lack of understanding can reach if you allow someone like Bill Kristol then to be used as a boogeyman for an entire understanding of especially of a dissident group. That if Kristol's against something, then that must make that thing good, or that must make that thing against the establishment. In the case of Trump, and all we needed was one step of analysis beyond that, and we kept making it. We kept on making it, and I'm sure some people got it, but it didn't apparently make its way even to deserving even a thought from these crews. So on up to the point of where it then becomes Scott Horton in this debate to sort of seal up. It's sort of like an endpoint in many ways of the 20th anniversary of September 11th. The end. It's after the Afghanistan war has been brought to a close, and that was the 9/11 war in many ways. Even though the 9/11 wars rage on in many ways, and definitely in terms of the ongoing rise of the surveillance state, the biosurveillance state. Remember this very little attended to part of the Project for New American Centuries white paper, Rebuilding America's Defenses, that talked specifically about the potential political usefulness of bioweapons. Ethnically targeted bioweapons may at some point go from a tool of terror to a politically useful tool, I think is the kind of language. And then the wake of September 11th and all of the deaths of the microbiologists. And now here we are up into the era of 3/11 and a global biowarfare pandemic that is as or way more serious in many ways in terms of its ongoing and globally and long-term implications than even September 11th itself. And so these are the kinds of structures that are been left in place, and almost like Scott Horton debating Bill Kristol on you guys were wrong to go to war, to sort of seal the end of the whole 20th anniversary of 9/11, in many ways was helping Bill Kristol and his whole crew to seal the credible door on 9/11. Nothing to see here, except for we shouldn't have responded the way that we did. And so I think that we should let's hone in a little bit on this what actually happened in that debate, and then the way that Dave Smith and Scott Horton talked about it, because I actually think they were much more accurate. They were much more instructive in the way they talked about it than the actual debate itself was, in terms of helping us understand maybe some of these more counterintelligence dynamics.
Yeah, and the way, as you said, ultimately, I think for as much as Scott Horton just completely wiped the floor with Kristol in terms of just, Kristol, as you identified, basically gave up during the debate. I mean, like after they initially talked for the first time, you can see, Kristol's basically zoned out. Like he's out of it. Like he's just sitting, reading, and just not even responding to anything. Like he was just a defeated man from the first time that Scott Horton spoke on. And it's in his lame defenses of America and why America's a force for good in the world. I mean, it can't stack up to the very honest, I think, obvious criticisms and exposures of things like the basic lies of things like the myth of the reasons for going to war, and these countries. But ultimately, where I think it's ultimately does not, where it ultimately is the problem at its very root, its very fundamental heart, is ultimately, and it's interesting because Scott Horton and Dave Smith compared this debate with Kristol and Horton to the Ron Paul, Rudy Giuliani exchange in the presidential debate back during the 2008 presidential campaign, which I believe for me was this political moment for me, really, that where I was just noticed, that's my first political memory was Ron Paul and Giuliani, and and remembering that. And Ron Paul was was this truth teller who was speaking the truth, when really what he did was simply say that our policies caused September 11th. And ultimately, if you look at that, I mean, like, this was hailed as like this famous moment that like helped really increase Ron Paul's visibility in the eyes of people and really put him out there as like this truth teller who was exposing the war, the war hawks and all this. When ultimately, Giuliani got the final say in that debate, if we recall correctly, in that exchange, by saying, well, you're blaming America for September 11th. And it's just absurd. And so this comparison of the Giuliani Ron Paul moment, when really, I think, at its deepest core, and it wasn't quite that, where like, I mean, Giuliani like was basically ridiculing Ron Paul for saying that blowback in America's policies caused September 11th. It wasn't like that here. You didn't have Bill Kristol like ridiculing Scott Horton for that. Bill Kristol was in no position to ridicule Scott Horton for anything. But at the same time, ultimately, Scott Horton's coming from a basic, fundamental mindset of reinforcing the event and the official, I would say, myth of the event that that the Bill Kristols of the world were able to push so much propaganda in the pages of the Weekly Standard, on Fox News, through neoconservative talk radio, and people around him, that was used. And you've got Scott Horton pushing those same basic myths. It was Al Qaeda attacked us, and blowback, and these policies, going to war in Iraq. Well, it's a criminally misguided effort to capitalize off of us being attacked by Al Qaeda on September 11th. And Iraq, Saddam Hussein didn't attack us on September 11th. Al Qaeda did. Why are we blaming Saddam Hussein for what Al Qaeda did? And so, at the basic fundamental level, Scott Horton, much like Ron Paul, the mistake, Ron Paul and Giuliani in that moment from 2000 and the 2008 presidential debates, at fundamental core, Scott Horton is reinforcing the same event that Bill Kristol is capitalized off of and profited off of. And I think without exposing, like, or at least attempting to try to get down to and exposing the myths of like the official September 11th narrative that's been put out there as conventional truth, that ultimately, I think somebody like a Bill Kristol, despite really being made to look terrible in this debate with Scott Horton, ultimately, I don't think that crew loses that much, because they're still able to argue their horribly flawed and admittedly terrible views on intervention and going to war and the war on terror, still arguing against people who at the basic level are still covering, knowingly or unknowingly, for the same official narrative behind the event that they have used to their advantage for the last 20 plus years. So I think at a fundamental level, I think that's a big negative, as much as Horton put out provocative information. There are other critiques that we have as well, geopolitically, as you mentioned, with the clean break and all this. But at a basic fundamental level, I think that Horton didn't come out of this thing as much as he did win the debate, so to speak. But I don't think it was as effective a victory, for sure. And I think it continues to allow the Kristols and their ilk to continue to have this platform and influence, because ultimately it's still not getting to the bottom of the event they have used to promote their wars for all these years. And of course, the events that they called for leading up to it, going back to what you said earlier, this was all just coincidental accident. The American deep state and their, Israeli Likudnik partners or whoever else just happened to take advantage of the perfect crime. And so I think it's very, it's not as, I think the victory kind of rings hollow from a bigger picture perspective when you're still meeting these people and willing to promote the same narrative that they are on the events that allowed them to push all of this propaganda so effectively.
Yeah. And there's an aspect of it that reminds me of, there's a little bit of, it feels a little bit like a teenager politics at some level. And that there's this sort of, yeah, we got him. we beat up the bully, or something like that in terms of Bill Kristol. But in terms of the kind of realpolitik, the real kind of politics that actually will uh, change things for the better and help deploy the non-aggression principle in practice, it's ultimately a Pyrrhic victory at best. At worst, it actually becomes like I think, a reinforcement of the cover up. Very simply, like if you, for example, if there's someone who who knows someone who murdered someone, and then the family of that person who got murdered came and challenged this person in a bar, and this person is Bill Kristol, let's say, in a bar, and Bill Kristol, was responding to the anger of this murdered the relative of this murdered individual, and swung back too much and either hurt or killed this person in response. And then someone like Scott Horton comes out and basically debates the response of Bill Kristol. You overreacted. Your people have a bad philosophy about how to deal with people who are traumatized by by other people, while not actually saying, "Oh yeah, it was wasn't it your buddy? Wasn't it your buddy who actually killed this guy's family in the first place?" And of course, Scott Horton morally makes that point. He makes that point in the moral arc of things, in making his blowback argument that there was a justness, not that it was right, the alleged action in response by Bin Laden and all that, but that Scott Horton over and over makes the case about the blowback hypothesis and about how it's understandable. And in that framework, it is understandable, and it seems like it's the moral language. But not if they didn't actually do it. It's not. It's actually pretty bad, because you're actually blaming somebody who didn't actually do something, while then also debating the friend of the guy who actually did do it without calling out the original murder. So at some level, you got to see it legitimizes the debate, rather than the pointing the finger at the actual murderer at some level. And it reminds me a lot of like what you just said, that they referred to it as the similar to the Giuliani Ron Paul moment. And it is, in terms of like the intellectuals, sort of like the movement nerds at some level, because it wasn't actually it wasn't a political moment in that way. That was on a debate stage. That was for the potential place of being the Republican candidate for president. But they also then missed the point. Like you said, they totally missed the point about the what was wrong with that Ron Paul moment. That sure, it was a big moment for the Ron Paul people and for the libertarians and for in an interesting way their allies on the blowback left, in terms of understanding the blowback of American imperial foreign policy. But for the 9/11 truth folks, the real 9/11 truth folks, the people who are also for a quote-unquote non-interventionist American foreign policy, i.e. a non-aggression principle-based American foreign policy, but based on truth, that was actually a massive, not only a failure, but almost like a betrayal by Ron Paul. And there's a whole background there in terms of all of the dynamics that even relates to We Are Change's role in 9/11 Truth, and then Ron Paul in relationship to 9/11 Truth, Alex Jones, InfoWars. And this is putting aside the real, very serious questions about 9/11 Truth itself. But that moment was not actually, that was a very similar moment in a certain way, but in a bad way. And this is what they're not looking at, that was also then Ron Paul not only allowing Rudy Giuliani the ultimate upper hand, by easily folding it into, well, America's guilty for having been attacked. You're never going to win that debate. But he also then helped seal the deal about what was credible speech in terms, or credible inquiry in terms of September 11th and the 9/11 wars and the geopolitics of all of that at the highest national political level. And meanwhile, Scott Horton, I would say, was actually maybe even more aggressive at some level, in a nice way, a very civil way, in pushing against, or sort of almost like browbeating Robbie Martin on his own podcast against the truther hypothesis, than Ron Paul was, even to me, being much more direct about my own hypothesis about who did 9/11 and why, and how Ron Paul, if he was serious, not only about the problem of high treason finance and the Federal Reserve, but then also about a non-interventionist foreign policy that I then called because he's a doctor, I reference, a do no harm foreign policy, that then you have to deal with the fact of how is the harm started in the first place? The real serious harm. It started by harm. And the harm is then coupled with deception. And then I pointed out a crew of neoconservatives that were looked to be associated with those who actually did September 11th for those reasons. And that wars are almost always started with deception, especially when they're started in relationship to what's alleged to be a democracy or a country that's acting in its self-defense. You're almost always going to have a deception. And Ron Paul did not browbeat me or, push back in the way that Giuliani did to him, or that Scott Horton did Robbie Martin on his own podcast. He basically acknowledged my basic point. This is on C-SPAN, Washington Journal, maybe 2012 or 13, so somewhere in there, I think. And admitted that that my point was sort of unavoidable in terms of the basis of most to all wars on deception, but then that he didn't have the information that I had in terms of this other thing, and then pointed out that the 9/11 Commission looked to be set up to fail. So I just want to point out that there is room for more aggressive truth telling out there, and it can sometimes result in not in sort of a blowback like a Giuliani ultimately turning Ron Paul's milquetoast non-interventionist response in the debate around 9/11 and the wars back around, but it can actually further the discourse. It can further the acceptable lines for where we can begin to speak publicly. And so that ultimately is like the core of my argument for this crew of people. And that would include even then like the Martins and Robbie and Abby Martin, but then also include Scott Horton and Dave Smith. And as human beings, I actually, putting aside the Martins for a second, we've always acknowledged that Robbie and Abby Martin are some of, if not the most talented documentarian journalist types who are who are siblings of their set, basically. I think that's, there's maybe just a handful of other people that you could point to. However, their analysis, we pointed to, is lacking in very significant ways. And ultimately, Robbie is, at this point, I'd say, at least 3 to 5 years behind on the 11/9 operation and the implications of it, and just beginning to reach a place of potential non-denial around it, while then also now beginning to make some progress on the 9/11 thing, where he stalled out for a while, would look to be in some kind of support of his sister's regression on 9/11 after she came under pressure, and she sort of went some kind of a John Gold route. People can go look back at what that might mean. We've discussed it before, but I see Robbie Martin making headway now in terms of 9/11. His new research in terms of the delving into the intelligence angle in a very particular fashion, especially in terms of Israeli intelligence following, apparently protecting or cultivating or framing the alleged hijackers, the alleged Al Qaeda cells in all of these locations, and there's a lot of deep research there, while also not rejecting the military angle part of the operation, like some other people have a tendency to do. And so he's open to that. He's not very firmly speaking about what common sense, what the basic physical forensics of September 11th force you to acknowledge about who could have possibly done it and why. But putting them aside for now, and we'll delve some more into that, because there's more stuff to deal with in terms of how to properly analyze both 9/11 and 11/9 forensically, I think, and why it politically matters for this moment. So we'll deal with some more of that. But I just want to say that as human beings, having not really known that much about the specific work of someone like Scott Horton, I knew some. I've listened to some of his radio shows before, and there's been a lot of value there. And there's also been times I remember like hearing him, let certain people off the hook. I remember him letting Alan, I forget this name, this Democratic congressman, Alan Grayson, off the Zionist hook a little bit too much for me, as it seemed like it in terms of one of his interviews. But in general, I've had an interesting, I believe he's brought a lot of value to the table that I've seen. And it is interesting. I remember going to I think it was a 10th Amendment, maybe it was even put on by Michael Bolden, I think, maybe a 10th Amendment gathering, seminar, or maybe a whole day kind of event in downtown LA, probably in 2010 or something like that. And he was asked specifically, maybe did I ask? I can't remember. Someone did, about September 11th and the OBL thing, and he was respectful. He did it very similarly, like the way he did with Robbie, where he just said he didn't believe the truthers that were right or something like that. That was the sort of the way that he put it. But my impression has generally been that and my impression now is that I like him as a human. Let me say it like that. And I also really like Dave Smith as a human in terms of what I get a sense of them. And yet politically, there is a major reckoning that needs to happen, especially right now, especially with all that we have on our table, and especially the role that these people play in terms of a crucial milieu, which is some kind of independent potential political thought, especially on the libertarian right, in certain spheres that really connect back to the left. And remember, one of the reasons that we first got into this whole line of analysis is because Robbie and Abby, who are unabashedly left, had decided to have Scott Horton on as their sort of big geopolitical analyst guest for the 20th anniversary of September 11th, in conjunction with the Afghanistan war ending. So there is this definite hook back to parts of the left. So there's a large full spectrum political implication here, I think, in terms of what these people either do or don't do.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say to follow up on that real quick, and this is something we're not going to pursue this discussion tonight, but I do think there's a good chance we will circle back to this in the future, and that brings up interesting questions regarding like this. The interesting questions getting into like the deeper nature of like the libertarian movement as we know it. And of course, you mentioned at the start Ludwig von Mises, and basically being sponsored, it looks like, by the Rockefeller, by elements of the Rockefeller family when he first came to the United States from Austria. And then there's other conversations to be had about like the Koch brothers and other aspects as far as libertarian movement. But there's an interesting history there with and maybe we talk a little bit about this, but the aspects of, Scott Horton, to me, like, he's not a right winger, so to speak. Like, you listen to Scott Horton and Dave Smith talk about things like, corruption and law enforcement, things like that, aspects of the real, I think, nature of the problem with police violence, with aspects of law enforcement. And it sounds to me like a more principled version of, and a more genuine version of what Alex Jones would say years ago, before he completely just abandoned any pretext of like being as far as like completely just going into the side of like rah law enforcement cops. They're conservative and they're trying to protect it. So, but so there's a lot of really good, I think, overlap with, say, like the Martins of the world, from like this libertarian left perspective. But there's also an underbelly, and I don't even know how much perhaps like a Dave Smith or a Scott Horton are understanding this, but there's an interesting backstory with like the history of like things like libertarian movement need to be taken into consideration, overlap with some of the elements that they consider, rightly so, I think, to be antithetical to their ideology of liberty, and of certainly going even back to a combination of very bad domestic political operations, as well as foreign policy and geopolitics. And if there was a conversation, they had correctly stated the American War on Terror post September 11th, like the corrupting of the as a as a vitally negative moment in terms of like the conservative movement or the right wing in America. But there's a deeper conversation to even be had outside of that. So it's interesting, this overlap, like this left libertarian overlap by, say, a Scott Horton, who I don't think would fall into the paleo conservative libertarian mindset of, like, say, Ron Paul, or maybe even somebody who's relatively close, it seems, ideologically, and perhaps even in terms of some type of like mentor relationship, it seems like, of, say, a Tom Woods, for example. But there's this overlapping of left libertarian in terms of I think, the good, but also very negative, as we've talked about, elements of geopolitics, of foreign policy. But it also comes with, I think, there is this, I don't know if I want to call it a dark side, but there is this deep history of aspects of what they espouse and believe in, that there is a very controlled nature too, in terms of an element that not only would be very antithetical, or very I'd say unsatisfactory, to say the least, to like people from the Martins milieu, but also, I think, from a bigger, even outside of like, paradigms of left and right, and conservative and liberal and progressive, and whatever the opposite to progressive would be, that I think really do cast a shadow over these political and otherwise ideological alignments. And so there's a deeper history to be really uncovered and dug into on that. And we talked about a little bit with, like, say, Murray Rothbard when we did our program on Arthur Finkelstein and his network. But there's a deep history there to really be delved into. And I think that's something that we at The Antidote may put some focus on as we go into 2022, or even towards things you're talking about, like a potential prospective Dave Smith presidential campaign. So that's definitely something to come back to. But I wanted to at least bring that up here with relation to this discussion with Scott Horton and the Martins, and these inroads, it seems, being made for some type of, perhaps at some level or another, political or ideological or activism based alliance at some level. And it's, I think, a much, not nearly as negative, or I would say, dare I say, destructive, as like the Glenn Greenwalds aligning with like the Tucker Carlson interest. But there's an element there that I think has a lot of negative to it as well. And so we'll get into that in the future, but I wanted to bring that up right now.
I appreciate that, and we should get into that in the future. And so I can see, moving forward here, there's these three areas that we should continue to keep touching on in the near future as we move forward. Now we're recording on, as you pointed out, Halloween, October 31st, 2021, and as we go into November, we're going to begin to do a deeper dive than we have done before in relationship to the Kennedy assassination, the Kennedy administration, and see what we can do in terms of a fuller understanding of that and how that helps us understand these longer term networks and our moment now. But in terms of this area that we've been covering this evening, I can see we still should continue to delve some more back into 9/11 forensics, the actual forensics surrounding September 11th. And that would not just be the military forensics, but the forensics of the entirety of the operation, and especially what people who either get sort of stuck in one of these sort of three categories of intelligence, i.e., the backstory, the legend, or the counterintelligence, i.e., the cover up, which could include a bad faith proponent of 9/11 truth, either as an individual or as a group or as a movement. That could also be very aptly covered in terms of a intelligence investigation. What's the best way to defeat the opposition is to lead it, right? Of course, that whole dynamic is crucial. That would then also include things like limited hangouts in terms of our main critique of Scott Horton in relationship to Bill Kristol, and how that ultimately plays out politically and intellectually by not challenging the originating aggressive act and the deception thereof. And then also the military forensics. What actually happened? What actually happened in terms of who did it, who did what, and why? The kind of thing that ultimately gets you to the something such as a concept of justice, which is the truth applied. It's not just the truth for the sake of the truth, or a pornographic sort of scintillating approach to endless excitement by more and more truth, so-called, but an application of the truth on reality, especially in these kinds of things. We're talking about things that are unabashedly criminal. And that it actually becomes one of the really key pieces here too that's being missed then by this crew, which I think should then continue the follow-up of the forensics of this crew and this libertarian approach, is that part of the issue here is that they're not actually making the strongest argument, and they're actually legally leading people into dead ends at some level, because this is a key point. And I've mulled this over a lot and talked a good bit about it in terms of September 11th, that there's a big difference between committing international war crimes based on a response to something that happened in the quote unquote homeland. There's not even a domestic crime that can be found, even if you were to find them guilty under what jurisdiction, and what effective jurisdiction internationally in terms of war crimes. You're sort of stuck in the Vincent Bugliosi kind of proposal of trying to get local DAs to indict George Bush for murder for lying us into the Iraq War. But September 11th, if you actually do the forensics of it, then you actually begin to connect to actual crimes in the so-called homeland itself, such as things like murder, such as things like conspiracy to commit murder, such as treason, the only crime defined in the Constitution, Article 3, Section 3. You could almost say that it's the originating, it's the crime that gives meaning in the entirety of not only the Article 3, the branch of the judiciary, the law in the Republic, but in some way it's because it's the only crime. It's obviously, if you see the Constitution as a contract, it's contract law based on the natural. This is what I believe is the best way for us to understand this. It's we the people have natural rights, and we contract a certain delegated and limited and well-defined group of administrative rights to the public sphere, i.e. the government. And that contract the only crime that actually sort of really breaks the contract is the crime of treason, i.e., you're doing the opposite of everything. And it doesn't matter what, okay, you might have had bad policy, you responded badly, your economic policy is ending up in eviscerating the industrial base of the country. And sure, you could find ways to define all these things, especially if they're done in relationship to foreign threats or enemies or nemesis seeking to wage war on the United States in a physical fashion, that those kinds of things could be seen as treason. But the actual ultimate act that would negate the constitutional contract writ large by we the people in relationship to our contractees, i.e., the government at large, and then our elected representatives, but then the entirety, not only the executive, the legislative, but also the judicial branch, it would be in relationship to acts of treason then that went unpunished or unaccounted for. And so that ultimate act of war against the United States itself, or giving aid and comfort to those that do. This is why I attempted to bait John Yoo into affirming that he believed that the executive branch, under a kind of neocon Straussian kind of executive will to power or unitary executive kind of theory, or a noble lie even kind of theory, that the executive branch had the right to wage or stage war, I said, against other parts of the government or against the people for reasons that they thought were valid. He wouldn't take the bait, but it ended up him admitting that he believed that the anthrax attack was a false flag. He didn't use those words, but I then basically did and said that, so this is actually, someone was trying to make it seem like the anthrax attacks that were, perpetrated against, including highest level U.S. senators, and shut down the U.S. Congress, I think, for the first time since the British had burned it during the War of 1812 in 1814. Someone wanted to make it seem with their scrawling handwriting that it was some kind of Islamo-jihadist Al-Qaeda type, death to America, death to Israel, Allah is great. And John Yoo, in the wake of not taking the bait around me trying to really prove the point about what these people potentially actually believe, they actually believe at some level, and this is what I imagine that Bill Kristol actually could potentially believe. And this is what needs to be called out if you're going to debate Bill Kristol, is that your milieu believes that you can actually stage war against the United States for your geopolitical cause. Those are the truths that are actionable towards justice in a constitutional system that would ultimately potentially result in the actual kind of non-aggressive, limited form of Republican government that libertarian types and minarchist types actually profess to desire, as at the very least as their stepping stone to their more anarchistic notion of freedom. And so, sure, there's all these sort of bigger things that we should probably debate about in terms of political philosophy. My concept of the hierarchy of sovereignty, and that they have to just reinsert the private as separate from the corporate, and the corporate is below the public, and the public is below the private, and then the private cannot exist unless the commons are protected. It doesn't mean that you protect the commons with the public, but we have to figure out a way to protect the commons, or else you can't have the private individuals. And once you fuse the private, which is natural rights, with the corporate, which is legal rights, and one sits on top of the public sector and the government and commands the nature of it, contracts it, and then the other, that's the private, that's the actual, we the people, the person, the individuals. Then the other, the corporate, sits underneath, and it is delegated a certain limited amount of contractual rights in relationship to our contractee, the government, then delegating a certain limited number of rights to the corporation. And so certain basic understandings could help, I think, facilitate a conversation about these sort of bigger political philosophy issues that I think the libertarians have. But what we can get to right now, and we need to get to right now, especially with this ongoing 311 operation, that the libertarians actually are potentially some of the better potential political actors in all of this, because they understand, they're not sort of MAGA chud heads where they pretend, most of them, they don't pretend like there's not actually, a threat, but they understand that both freedom and security ultimately have to be protected in some way. And so I guess my basic point here is, let's get to the heart of the argument that I think we should be able to agree upon, is that if there are war crimes that are based on originating treason, then you can't just call out the war crimes. You have to call out the originating treason, I would say, first and foremost. And then that will then potentially then resolve the situation of the international war crimes and the aggression principle deployed abroad. So let's grapple with the aggression principle deployed in the so-called homeland first.
On the note of 311, of COVID, of the situation with that, I think that there's another conversation to be had in terms of like the overlapping of narratives that were used in terms of shaping the narrative around COVID, and perhaps some overlapping with some very bad interests, once again, with elements of the libertarian politics, libertarian activism. And that's another conversation. But on that note, I will add that I think this is one of the flaws of not trying to get to the bottom of deep networks, and is that there was, while I don't think that Scott Horton is a fan of Ron DeSantis per se, there was a perhaps not exciting, I wouldn't quite call it an endorsement, but like there's this idea that, DeSantis was like a hero for liberty in terms of his handling of COVID, and therefore like almost holding out, like there's an element there of like, ultimately if we can't get behind this guy totally, then we can, perhaps he's better than some of the opposition or whatever, because he's doing the right thing regarding COVID. And of course, we would identify DeSantis as a major political operative in terms of this bigger operation we've been discussing, his name being put out there on this national level as perhaps like the follow-up to Trump, if not Trump himself, and a lot of consequences coming from him as the governor of Florida, and things that are being promoted and pushed there, and Florida's role perhaps in the further dissolution of the union, which has very much been pursued by this international and domestic operation that we've been at. So I wanted to throw that in there as an example of like the strict ideology to things like their concept of liberty, which I think is right a lot. I do think that like liberty versus security, I would more or less side with aspects of more pure libertarian thinking on that. But then like, this idea, this poison pill of like, DeSantis could be viable because he's a hero for liberty and how he's handling COVID. I wanted to throw that in there. And also, Jeremy, I want to mention two other notes about the debate. Maybe this will be starting to wrap up as I do this, but two other notes from both the Horton Kristol debate and the follow-up interview with Dave Smith was one, Bill Kristol being portrayed as, and there's an element of this that is correct in terms of like the media operation, Bill Kristol's Weekly Standard, his influence through Fox News, through talk radio, or his network, and in terms of even elements of the administration itself, were key to pushing the propaganda talking points post September 11th that led to these illegal criminal wars of aggression. But Kristol was almost described as like the reason why, name drops some names, Douglas Feith, Richard Pearl, David Wormser. Horton name dropped Abram Shulsky, a key player behind the Office of Special Plans, as this is the reason. Like that Kristol was the reason. Kristol was a primary source of propaganda, but Bill Kristol wasn't in Dick Cheney's office actively pursuing. It wasn't, Bill Kristol wasn't responsible for that. And it's interesting just throwing in there Abram Shulsky, these types of people, not even trying to, like, once again, try to get to the identify where there could potentially be some not entire overlap in terms of their philosophies and in terms of their aims and motivations and what they're pushing for, but also like somehow Kristol is like a primary reason for their success. I was wondering, I would ask Scott Horton, well, is Bill Kristol responsible for Michael Malouf's success in pushing a post September 11th pro-war propaganda? I mean, since I don't know if Horton and Malouf are at all if they even know each other, if there's any type of association there. But of course, we've identified Michael Malouf as a player in terms of Russian state propaganda operating in the U.S. via RT and Sputnik, and his role with Feith and Worms, or even being identified as the primary source for the infamous Judith Miller, going back to Franklin 4 in New York Magazine in 2004. Profile of Judith Miller identified Michael Malouf as basically her primary source. So anyway, I would wonder what he would say about Malouf there. But this idea that Kristol's the reason why Abram Shulsky had so much success post September 11th. I mean, there's an element of truth that from a media propaganda perspective, but I think ultimately that falls flat. Then the other thing I wanted to mention was the going back to, and I mentioned this before, the geopolitical element, and I think it goes back to September 11th, but it's also very obviously vital with 11/9. I'm reiterating something I said earlier here, but I just wanted to go back to it again. There was a conversation, and one of the things that Horton mentioned in his debate with Kristol was the hostility towards Russia. The neocons are so hostile to Russia. And then in the conversation with Dave Smith, a dismissal of Russia, Russia's just a regional power. There's no influence compared to anything the Americans are doing in the world. And from a pure military boots on the ground perspective, I think that that's probably not entirely incorrect. But in terms of foreign influence that's, I think, very nearsighted to say the least.
And it sounds similar to the people who's the Chomsky line on Israel from a different perspective. That's
a good point.
Yeah.
That's a good point. And so I'll finish my point here going twofold on that argument. Number one is that, as I mentioned before, I think it's that's very counterproductive that you're not allowed, basically good libertarians or good anti-war people, good anti-intervention people are not allowed to cite actual threats, actual hostile foreign and domestic through the same bigger network that they are so rightfully opposed to, I think, in so many ways. You're not allowed to actual threats because that's hawkishness. That you're a war hawk, because we've gone back and identified the Max Blumenthals and the Aaron Mattes, and the way they'd put it is, well, if you're going to criticize any type of Russian operations, either domestic influence or geopolitically, well, you just want to start a new Cold War with the Russians or whatever. And I think that Horton is very similar in that regard of not being able to see an actual threat or identify an actual threat because that's bad, and you're just if you're not either apologizing for America or you're trying to inflame hostilities, which of course you can talk about these actual threats without doing that, but that's one. And then the other thing I think is that I've talked about this before, I think in terms of Abby Martin. I think we've had a discussion about this in the past in terms of and she's not the only one by far, but when you basically I want to be careful on how I frame this, because I don't want to necessarily say it's apologism, but when you defend actual regimes who are actually doing things that are negative, I think you lose. I think there's an element of you that loses some. It's at a different level than not being honest about the inherent nature of the actual basic fundamental lies about something like September 11th. But there's an element of this to where I think that the Hortons arguing that simply Russia is an innocent victim of neocon aggression, or insert country here, China, for example. I think there's an element of that also to where that can be used. I mean, Bill Kristol wasn't in a position to do it because I think he was so neutered by Horton. I mean, it's not the best example here, but that can be used also to discredit your perspective, your stance. If you are running, it's kind of, it's like, Horton won't run apologetics for Israel, and he would be very critical of people who do. But in a similar strain, when you just, Russia's doing, they're doing no wrong in the world, and it's just simply neocon aggressions, the reason why people are critical of anything that goes on in terms of the Russian sphere, whether it's geopolitically or whether it's even here in the US with active measures. I think that opens you up for attack as well, as the other side can rightfully point to you being knowingly or unknowingly covering for and defending actual, other regimes, other places that are doing negative and so I just wanted to bring that in there. I think that I think it both it runs, I think, a veneer of protection for actual hostile elements, while at the same time also opening you up to attack, because that can be used to discredit you as well, as people can point to actual real things that have been done by some of these entities that are defended ultimately by this anti-war element that ultimately comes down to anything that's just not simply America bad, ultimately is just trying to warmonger. So I just want to bring that in there. And that would be my final point for this whole conversation for this go around, at least.
Well, I appreciate that very much, and I think it's a good point for us to end on, in that this is the other key thread of this. I think that you just put in here, that in a similar way, that if you are principled non-aggression, anti-war at the international level, and you fail to call out the war on the people, at the very least, of the United States, in terms of the originating incident and who did it and why, and whether it's the same people that quote unquote responded to it are the ones that also, at least the very least, know the people who did it. Let's say that this other piece is that if you then don't deal with these networks, these transnational networks and international networks, and bad actor elements, in terms of maybe not, we're not talking about bad moral actor in that way, although obviously some of it is, but just saying that nemesis, that there are foreign nemesis, and then especially when you then see something like 11/9, and you, in a way that goes way beyond something like 9/11, you see this very intense Netanyahu, Putin, Israeli, Russian axis teamed up directly with these domestic elements, who are the ones in a sort of parallel fashion to 9/11, that waging this 11/9 war operation, in this case with these foreign elements. Then if you don't deal with the truth of the matter, first of all, putting aside the whole question of if you are, the way that you respond to what Russian active measures are doing in relationship to Israel, in terms of 11/9, and Trump, in terms of what you were saying about like someone like Max Blumenthal, that like if you even sort of criticize Russian action, then you are misplacing your attention. Abby Martin got into that a lot in terms of Russia and China, in many ways. But beyond that, but if you're you're being told to actively deny, or you're being misled from actually looking at the forensics of the operation itself, whether 9/11 or 11/9, and whatever these foreign elements are doing, you're then going to then also miss the domestic element in operation to this, which all these people did, in terms of the seriousness of 11/9 and Trump MAGA at a more macro level. And then, of course, this then leads directly back into your other point that you made here about some of the serious questions that need to be dealt with in terms of these specific political networks in relationship to those who actually did 11/9. especially something like the CMP networks. That is not very far from the aspects of libertarianism, the background of Mises, this whole sort of scenario that ends up being the Mises caucus inside of the Libertarian Party. Ron Paul, CNP is right there. So in 11-9, whereas these people, let's say someone like Scott Horton, are obviously a direct nemesis of the, at the very least, the 9/11 operators' result. In this case, around 11-9, they seem to be much closer to the perpetrators. And in many ways, at the very least, they're intensely facilitating the cover-up by not
And
acknowledging
going
that
back
anything
to
happened.
and going back to like Dawson, what I the point earlier about Dawson and Bernard Carrick and even Rudy, and like the lining up of terms of talking points when it comes to the organized left and all this, you find yourself by doing that also, in a lot of ways, probably unknowingly. I'd like to think more than knowingly, but nonetheless, ideologically, aligning it or sounding like, the people that you're trying to expose for, at the very least, profiting off of and benefiting from the previous event. So I think that brings you back to, in a lot of ways, you end up supporting what you say you despise the most.
So I think this is an important place that we leave this, and then we begin to pick back up on when we delve back in here, specifically on some of these forensics around the counterintelligence issues here, both in terms of how powerful the cover up is, both in terms of 9/11, but also even more intensely in terms of 11-9, directly by these circles of political actors. But then also this bigger issue of the macro questions around the evolution, the historical development of libertarianism as a political movement in an American context, and how, at its root, it's obviously, I'm not trying to be xenophobic. And I'm not a xenophobe. I'm open to the ideas of others, of people who don't come from the United States. But I'll just point out again, over and over again, whether it's the left or the right, there's always some kind of appeal to European men from the 19th and 20th centuries. We also have American thought, actually. Some of it is actually indigenous, too. It would include even indigenous people's approaches to governance and circles of governance, and the importance of grandmothers in governance. But it also includes even our own men of European origin in an American context, of people like Henry George, in terms of other approaches to economics and land-based economics, geoeconomics, that appear to actually function much more effectively and much more in integrity with the possibility of the American system, let's call it. And so that is something that needs to be dealt with, is that we're talking about, the Austrian school, and that is now here in the United States under the guise of the libertarian movement and the Mises caucus, right? This is an Austria. This is it goes back to Austria, right? And so there's a question there. There's just something beyond just the sort of the Rockefeller Foundation sponsorship of the originating, immigration of Van Mises to the United States. There's this other bigger question in terms of, what about our indigenous American political thinking here? Do we really need to always lean on whether it's the right and the Austrian school, or the left and the Marxists and the Keynes? No, we don't. Can we learn from it? Sure. Should we read? Sure. Should we discuss? Yes. Debate? Yeah. But let's actually think from first principles in an indigenous American way, that there's possibilities here of thinking beyond the European box in that way. Okay. and that this is something different here. This is something different, and it's not just European. There's something else also going on here, and so that aspect, I think, we begin to need to look at both in terms of just pure intellectual history and questions of best political philosophical outcomes, but also in terms of counterintelligence questions about the kinds of things that we're beginning to look at. And so that would even run up into, last thing is that, like, when you brought up this real problematic issue, the way that they talk about someone like DeSantis as some kind of, potential proponent of liberty. I believe it's more plausible that Ron DeSantis is something like some kind of like deep sleeper, intergenerational Russian illegal kind of asset than it is that he's some kind of proponent of valuable liberty in the midst of a biowarfare attack that has still not been resolved, and there's still no resolving proposals from this libertarian set. So you need to have liberty and security. If you want to ensure liberty, you also need to take security seriously. And the best libertarians totally understand that. They believe that security can be secured not by the monocultural or the monopoly on force that they believe the state, sort of secures for itself over the long period of time. They have other ideas about how you might use liberty to protect security. So that's not the problem. But the problem then is, how then does that actually manifest? And saying that Ron DeSantis is some kind of governor for liberty, even if it's just in terms of COVID, is not even, I don't think, it doesn't even track to the best of libertarian principles, which understands you got to have both liberty and security. That liberty actually leads to security is actually their argument. It's a very good argument, actually. But they're not even making that argument. And so, all right, there's a lot to discuss here, Greg. It could go on all night on some of these matters, and but we will return to these matters. And so, all right, it was very cool to talk to you about this. Thank you, Greg.
Yeah, no doubt. Same to you.
All right, thank you, everybody out there. Until next time, Antidote. We are out.